evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I first ask, can everybody hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is John Tickner. I'm the president of the Porthcawl Lions Club, at least for another 10 days. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. We've got a very good turnout, so we're very grateful. Thank you very much for coming. I'll start off with the advert. Lions clubs were formed in America in 1917 with just 24 clubs. Now, 100 years later, there are 44,000 clubs in over 200 countries with nearly 1.5 million members, and it's the biggest organisation of this type in the world. Nobody here will, everybody here will know about the Grenfell Tower disaster. We do have a collection box on the way out. If anybody would like to make a contribution, then we'd be very happy for you just to put a £5 note or a £10 note. Or even a 10p piece, so that'll be fine. Thank you very much. You can't hear? You're okay now? Okay, thank you. All clubs have been encouraged to put on a special event to celebrate the Lion centenary, and we are delighted that Professor Niall, not Niall, but Niall Ferguson has come along to speak to us tonight. He's a man of multiple talents and many interests, and our thanks go to him for his willingness to give up some of his precious time to be here tonight. So without further ado, Niall Ferguson.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. It sounds a bit like the beginning of a joke. A Scotsman walks into a church in South Wales. Now, I'd have to tell a very good joke indeed to justify your giving up an hour or so of your time on such an exquisite, and it must be said, un-Welsh evening, when the overwhelming majority of your fellow citizens are enjoying a pint outside their favourite pub. I'm not a comedian, I'm a historian, and so I can't really offer you much in the way of jokes, but I thought it made some sense to explain why a Scotsman walked into a church in South Wales. Why on earth am I here? Why did I end up in Porthcawl, in Scare House? Well, I want to try and answer that question honestly. You may be thinking, well, he just couldn't be bothered to go all the way home to Scotland. And it is true that Porthcawl is significantly nearer to Heathrow Airport, where I live, or sometimes feel I live, than, say, Oban, or any of the other places in Scotland that I used to go on my holidays. But it's not just that this is the nearest place that isn't England. I've been thinking a lot about not England, because when you reflect on Wales and Scotland and Ireland, they have many things in common, but the thing that they have in common the most is that they are not England. I've spent much of my life in England. I went there as a young man to study in Oxford. I escaped from Glasgow, got over the fence, dug a tunnel, got to Oxford. So I have nothing against England, and there are English people in the audience tonight. There are things, though, that make Wales and Scotland and Ireland different from England. I was struck by this when I went to my favourite pub, the Prince of Wales, the other night. Now, officially, the Prince was shut. It was a Monday night, and Gareth, who many of you know, had been working all weekend. He was sitting outside with a few friends, having a well-deserved rest. The minute he saw us, he sprang to his feet and said, "Although we are not open, would you like a drink?" That would not happen in the village in Oxfordshire where my mother, who is here tonight, thank you for coming, Mum, lives. Because when the pub is closed in Murcott, it is closed. So the not Englandness of Porthcawl certainly played a part. A certain kind of pub. A certain kind of conversation about rugby. Because we all agree that whatever else happens, England must lose. That unites us, and I've had many conversations on this subject on the beach at Skirrow. The Atlantic hits Wales, and it hits Ireland, and it hits Scotland in a special way. It doesn't really hit England that way at all, unless you count Cornwall, which isn't really England. When you go there, it's only barely culturally English. In fact, the pubs there will tend to serve you after hours too. But no, I am not here simply because it's not England and nearer than Scotland. In fact, my family has a long-standing connection to Wales. Although I am 100% Scottish, my grandfather moved to Abergavenny when I was a tiny baby. And I believe almost the first photographs of me were taken in Abergavenny. My grandfather did not have my good fortune. He worked from an early age and never went to university. But he was a more cultured man and a better read man than nearly everybody I have ever met who went to a university. And his love of literature extended far beyond Scottish literature and English literature to Welsh literature. I was introduced to Dylan Thomas with as much enthusiasm as I was introduced to Robert Burns. Only the other day, a friend came to visit us at Skirrow. An Argentinian with a Dutch girlfriend. They looked a little bemused. I think nothing had quite prepared them for the Prince of Wales. And as I was saying goodbye to them, I said, look, you'll understand all this much better if you just listen to the recording of Under Milkwood, which Richard Burton made in his prime. And I still think it is one of the most beautiful pieces of drama that has ever been recorded. And everybody, I hope, in this church has a copy at home. Play it to your children. It will inspire them. So we had always a Welsh connection. When I was a boy Thomas's age, my father, who died sadly just 2 years ago, would take me twice a year to Murrayfield to watch the rugby. And that meant that every 2 years we were beaten by Wales. I never minded losing to Wales, because in the second half, as the tries were being run in by the greats of Welsh rugby, the Welsh fans would sing. And there was something beautiful about that singing than anything I've ever heard in any football stadium or rugby stadium, much less any baseball stadium around the world. It was almost worth losing to Wales to hear Land of My Fathers ringing out throughout Murrayfield. We never felt ill will towards the Welsh fans. We knew their side was better, and we accepted defeat with a good grace. Unlike when England beat us, whenever we lose to England, which we will not next year, but whenever we lose, you do realise that is a moral victory for Scotland. We only ever experience victory or moral victory against England. Now, why Sker? Well, Sker is history. I'm a historian because I'm fascinated by the human past. And I take the rather simple position that you cannot understand anything if you don't know where it came from. No matter what it is. This town. Sker is a daily reminder, each time I see a picture of it, and each time you walk past it, of where we all came from. Its history is an extraordinary thing in itself. This was a house that once was a grange house of Neath Abbey, at a time when monks ran the abbey. Through the Reformation, its fate was transformed. A family with the wonderful name of Turberville came into ownership. And all the storms of religious conflict that racked the British Isles in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and into the 18th century buffeted that house to the point that a Jesuit priest was captured there and convicted because, of course, at the time that he was captured in the late 17th century, it was illegal for a Roman Catholic priest to hold services in Wales, and hanged, drawn and quartered in Cardiff. He was later canonised. The house has its own saint. Now, I could go on, but suffice to say that nothing inspires me more when it comes to sit down and write about the past than to be surrounded by it. To be in a house that has seen so much that no matter how badly we misbehave, and I can assure you, on New Year's Eve we always misbehave, no matter how badly we misbehave, the house has seen much, much worse. It was wild country once upon a time, before the golf course, before the steelworks, before the motorway. This was wild country. Boats wrecked on Sker Point. The kind of religious conflicts we associate with a completely different world today were going on here. You watch it on your televisions, happening in countries from Afghanistan to Syria. But remember, just a few hundred years ago, we in the British Isles were engaged in bloody religious wars. And Sker reminds me of that, and reminds me not to take for granted the peace that we subsequently found in this country. I do have one piece of bad news, however. Contrary to the information provided by the Welsh Tourist Board and others, there is no ghost at Sker House. There is no such thing as a ghost. If you believe in ghosts, you should see a scientist. There have occasionally been nannies who have claimed to have had supernatural experiences in one room associated with the Maid of Sker. Sally, who is here tonight, is not that kind of a person. So there are no ghosts at Sker, but who needs ghosts? History is a ghost enough for me. And my sense of those past generations who lived in that house, who farmed that land, that's enough without any need for Ghostbusters to come and visit. Now, firmly committed to not speaking for more than 10 more minutes. And then I want you to ask me questions. But in the remaining 10 minutes, I want to explain another thing, which is why I came to be involved with the Lions. The Lions Club and I go back, well, I think, Martin, it's 10 years, we decided. But what brought us together? The answer, like many of my answers, is rubbish. When I came to Scour, which is now more than 13 years ago, I was struck by the contrast between the stunning natural beauty of the coastline and the appalling amounts of rubbish that covered it. I had never seen so many plastic bottles in one place, almost entirely obscuring the sand. So many plastic bags, so many cans of beer. It was deeply shocking to me. And because I'm that kind of person, I began to pick up the litter. It was a futile task for one man, so I naturally conscripted my family. The children I made pick up litter bitterly resented spending their weekends with large black bags, filling them up with litter, and it must say they'd never stuck at it for very long. I began a rather, I suppose, pathetic effort to attract local support. I said, if you'll come and help, I would say this to passing strangers, if you think this is terrible and you'll come and help, you can have lunch. And if you want to have a look at the house, you can do that too. So we went in for forced multiplication. But this was really multiplication that got you to about 12 people. Now, Rachel and Richard, who look after Scale, will remember those days. It was essentially one sausage per bag of rubbish. And I think the rubbish was winning at that point. 2 sausages. I think in my mind it was 1. I am Scottish, remember. But then I met Martin. And Martin saw the opportunity for the Lions to do what they do, which is to tackle a local problem, mobilise their members, and fix something that needed fixing. What used to seem impossible became possible, thanks to the Lions. And I was deeply moved by the fact that with each passing year after that first meeting, it got better and better and better. And if you haven't noticed the transformation of that coastal path that runs from Porthcawl towards Port Talbot, then you should see an optician, because it's stunning. And I'm here in large part to say thank you to Martin and all his fellow Lions for making it possible. About 5 years ago now, I had to give the BBC Reef lectures. And I was thinking a lot about the many social and economic problems we confront as a nation. And one of the arguments I made in those lectures was that many problems cannot be solved simply by expecting the government to do it. And the more we expect the government to do it, the more we're likely to be disappointed. Because many problems are best solved by voluntary associations, by local people working together in just the way the Lions did, with a common purpose and no other incentive but to make the place better. Your mayor is here tonight. I'm honoured that she's joined us. But she was telling me before we began that rubbish is still a major problem, as it is for most coastal towns, especially in the summer. It's a problem that ultimately can be solved not only by the Lions, but will require action from local government. but it's a perfect illustration of the way I see the world, that we made a difference to the rubbish along the seafront by just doing it. And I couldn't have done it without you, Martin. And I'm so tremendously proud of what you Lions achieved, and you all deserve a big hand for what you did. I think it's really fascinating to hear that your mayor does not belong to an established political party, and that Porthcawl First became Porthcawl Forward. A rather bigger version of this has just happened in France, so you could have called it Porthcawl En Marche. But this is an illustration of how things can change, again, when local initiative supplants established central government and central national parties. I find that deeply uplifting. The Great Degeneration is the name of that book, and I think it's the only book in which I've explicitly talked about Scaring and Porthcawl. But I calculated today that it's one of 7 books that I've wholly or partly written in that house, covering subjects as diverse as World War II, financial history, the life of Henry Kissinger, Western civilization. I take on relatively modest subjects, as you will realise. And most recently, a book that I've just finished, in fact, today I finished the copy editor's queries, a book called The Square and the Tower, which is a history of networks. That book will be published in October. And it illustrates on a large scale the very specific point that I've just made. Much of the change that has come in the world through history has not been achieved by great men, by governments. It's been achieved by networks, by associations, by groups like this one. We voluntarily came together. I said I'd give a talk. You decided to come, despite the fantastic weather. It must have been tempting not to come. I know at least one senior member of the Lions was rather unhappy to be reminded of the event. But here we are. Nobody made us come. Nobody ordered us to come. We're part of the most magical thing about the human species. Its ability to work through networks, collectively, together, to organise itself, often in the simplest way. And sometimes that kind of association can change the world. As I was writing the Square and the Tower, I kept coming across examples of networks like the Lions through history that have actually changed the world. The revolutions of 1989 probably seem a long time ago to you now, but I can't remember a time like that, perhaps until now, when so much history has been made so fast. But when you go back to the revolutions of 1989 and ask why it was that communism fell in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, all over Eastern Europe, one of the best explanations is that groups like the Lions, as well as church groups, finally had had enough of totalitarianism, of centralized control, of lack of freedom, and said, we are taking this into our own hands. Now, I don't think we need a revolution in Porthcawl, don't get me wrong. But it does bear remembering that even an occasion like this, which seems modest and doesn't aspire to anything more radical than to make sure the vintage car race goes well, which I think is the next big Lions event in August. And yet groups like this, people like us, have changed the world. It was rooms like this and people like you who made the civil rights revolution happen in the United States. It began in southern churches. Our colleague at Stanford, Condi Rice, has just published a book about democracy, but she begins with the civil rights movement and her experience as a girl in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. Never underestimate yourselves. Never underestimate the ability of a group of people this size, if they're part of a network like the Lions, which, as we were reminded, is a global network, the ability of us to change the world. Let me conclude. My wife, Ayan, is a nomad. When we first met, agreed that we were both nomads, of no fixed abode. One from Scotland, the other from Somalia. We met in New York City. No particular place was home. But, home is where you make it. It's not necessarily what you're given. And we've been incredibly fortunate to find ourselves able to make a home here, amongst you, in this most beautiful of places, in one of the most beautiful houses I know. We feel really lucky. We feel lucky because we've been accepted here, despite the fact that neither of us is remotely Welsh. And so this is the note I want to end on. I want to end by thanking you for making us part of your network. I began by saying it sounded a bit like a joke. A Scotsman walks into a church in South Wales. But imagine a Scotsman and a Somali walk into a church in South Wales. Now that has the makings of a really good joke. But even better would be a Scotsman and a Somali walk out of a stifling church and into a pub. But that comes later. First, some questions. Thank you very much indeed. There are roving mics. I don't know how they will rove, but there's a gentleman in a checked shirt who is very quick off the mark, right there.
There's supposed to be people attached to them.
Where are our mic rovers? This is when the voluntary association springs into life. We need to get our microphone to that gentleman in the checked shirt and the shorts. Yes, sir.
History is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies and misfortunes of mankind. That was Edward Gibbon. Niall Ferguson, a couple of days ago in the Sunday Times, wrote, "Ghastly events are bound to happen now and then. The thing to worry about is the historical trend." Who's right, you or Gibbon? It's you. What trend is Britain undergoing? Why should we worry about it?
Well, that's a great question. But I'm assuming that not everybody heard it without the microphone, so I'll repeat it. I won't get the Gibbon quote exactly right. We've definitely got a rogue microphone out there. I don't think it's mine. Thanks. Edward Gibbon, the greatest historian ever to write in the English language, described history as a record of the crimes and follies of mankind. And I think it was last weekend, made the argument that, well, stuff happens. Tragedies, disasters, crimes happen. The question is, what is the trend? You should be worried if the frequency of disasters is going up. Now, if you remember, Gibbon's most famous work was The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That was the trend that Gibbon described. And over multiple volumes, it's a vast work, Gibbon described, in fact over about 1,000 years, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Your question, sir, was, is there a comparable trend in Britain? And I'll widen it and ask, is there a comparable trend in Europe? I worry that there may be. if one simply looks at the statistics, at the numbers, there is no question that the frequency of terrorist attacks in Europe, and now including in Britain, is rising. To the point that I worry it becomes normality. Though when I look on my phone and I see, as happened yesterday, that a bomber has been shot in Brussels, it just seems like a routine event. The most dangerous thing to be in the world is a frog in a saucepan. Thomas, if you ever find yourself in a saucepan, get out, no matter how comfortable the water is, because the frog doesn't notice as the water gradually turns from tepid to boiling. I've never tried this on a frog because I'm not a cruel person. I always figured the frog probably would notice, but the figure of speech is that the frog doesn't notice. I worry that we are the frog. The water is getting steadily hotter, and we are not quite ready to face it, because we don't want to face the possibility of an escalation in that kind of conflict. What if vans are the new guns? I had written a column just before the most recent attack in London on the Finsbury Park Mosque, saying that I worried about political violence in the United States, but I worried about it less here. But that's because there are so many more guns in the United States. But what if we don't need guns? What if vans are the new guns? So I worry. The good news is, and I don't want you all to leave depressed, that we have a long way to go before we are, to give just one example, where Sarajevo suddenly was in the early 1990s. We shouldn't exaggerate the scale of the problem. Compared with the IRA's mainland bombing campaign, Islamic State has a long way to go in terms of its body count. But a key lesson of history is that things can escalate fast. Not everything in history goes slowly. Not everything follows a nice, steady arithmetical progression. Often the trend in history looks like that, or like that. Things escalate quickly, or they fall apart quickly. And that's why I study and teach history, because we all need to understand that, so that we don't underestimate what could be a very dangerous trend. I also do short answers, but you have to ask easy questions. Now, do we have another question or two? And if we do, we do. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for pointing out the similarities between the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish, and not the English. I wonder if you could look from where you are to your own country in Scotland and look at the situation, the government there, a government that believes in big government, believes in social engineering, believes in a kind of cradle to the grave socialism. But I'd like your opinion on maybe the best thing for Scotland would be to be independent from the United Kingdom so they can get back to normal politics rather than have this large government kind of thinking, which is a luxury that they get on the basis of a soft budget constraint paid for by English taxpayers.
What a great question. I am a Scot, but I am not a Scottish nationalist. I was opposed to independence when we had a referendum back in 2014. I would be against it if we had another. But I see what you mean. For many years, I've been deeply frustrated by the growing tendency of my fellow Scots to blame everything on England, and at the same time to accept large transfers from England to pay for a system that increasingly differs from the English system. You mentioned the phrase from the cradle to the grave. And I've often thought that what the Scottish nationalists aspire to is to get you there as quickly as possible. We'll get you from the cradle to the grave faster than any other political party in Europe. Scotland has, particularly the part I come from, the west of Scotland, has long excelled at preventing improvements in mortality. In fact, I think we share the unenviable distinction with the Russians of having about the worst life expectancy in the developed world. And the Scottish nationalists are gradually being held to account for the fact that their approach does not work. One of the puzzles of the last election was the fact that the Conservatives did better in Scotland than almost anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Now, you can attribute that to Ruth Davidson's talent as a politician, and she's clearly talented. But another very obvious reason is that the Scottish nationalists are no longer credible when they claim that Scotland's problems are somehow not Scotland's own problems. The SNP is no longer credible when it argues that if only we could have independence, things would be better. People don't believe that. And they do realise that the SNP is responsible for deteriorations in Scottish education, which used to be the envy of the rest of Europe, as well as other basic public services. I'm glad about that. I'm glad that the Scottish electorate is seeing through the SNP, seeing through Nicola Sturgeon's admittedly compelling rhetoric, and understanding that what devolution did was to empower Scotland to govern itself a good deal more autonomously than Wales. And right now, they are not delivering. And they've paid for that politically. Some of us never thought we would see Conservatives elected in Scotland again. I think it's very healthy that that is no longer the case. But I don't want the UK to break up. I think the UK would be worse off if it disintegrated. Because collectively, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, together are greater than the individual parts. And the United Kingdom is a more important country than most people living in it appreciate. We somewhat tend to underestimate ourselves. It's that British habit of self-deprecation. We can't quite believe that we're the fifth, or is it now sixth, largest economy in the world. That seems implausible, and yet it's so. So, one of my hopes is that the United Kingdom, which is currently going through a difficult time, will, in the process that we call Brexit for short, rediscover some of its historic virtues. I was opposed to Brexit. But I came to realise that it might be for the best. In the sense that Brexit leaves the continental Europeans to pursue their federal project, and it forces the United Kingdom to recognise that not all its problems can be blamed on Brussels. That much I can live with. But if you start breaking up Britain, then I don't think I like the destination that you end up with. So, leave Nicola Sturgeon inside the United Kingdom, responsible for a lot of public services in Scotland, and held accountable as a result of that responsibility. That system seems to me to be viable, and one that ultimately will allow the United Kingdom to reform itself. We have a long way to go to fix the problems that this country faces. We haven't really, despite all the talk of austerity, fixed the problem of British public finance. The central problem of an ageing population with a system that was designed for a relatively young population. A welfare state that we fundamentally can't afford. We haven't fixed that. But I don't think breaking up Britain is likely to be the solution. I promised you short answers, and I'm just not giving them. The lady at the back, yes, please.
You have of late been quite active on social media. Is it good, bad, or ugly?
Social media are a part of the book I just described. The Square in the Tower asks the question, is an interconnected world in which everybody is on Facebook or on Twitter a good thing? Now, Mark Zuckerberg certainly thinks it's a good thing. And so do Sergey and Larry, who founded Google, and so does Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon. They think it's a good thing because it's making them fantastically wealthy. But is it a good thing for us? We don't own it unless you were smart enough to buy stock in Amazon and Facebook and Google. We use it, or we use these platforms. And I've come to the conclusion that we must use them with extreme care. That the idea of a massively interconnected world is not a utopia. It may prove to be the exact opposite. And one reason I think that is that when you start to think about how these different platforms interact, it's not necessarily the case that they promote greater public enlightenment or mutual understanding. Those of us in politics will know that on the whole, it is not the nicest people in the community who take to Twitter or Facebook or the comments section at the end of your article to exchange views. Oddly enough, these social media, which were promised would bring us together, seem increasingly to drive us apart, to polarize opinions, to create silos and echo chambers in which we only communicate with the people who agree with us. And somehow in the process of communicating with them, we move even further along the spectrum than we were to begin with. I see that in the United States, and I see it here too. James Naughtie, another Scot, whom you may hear on the radio now and again, once described Twitter to me as the global urinal wall. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. It was never the nice people who wrote on the urinal walls, was it? I remember well the urinal walls in my school, and by and large it wasn't views of great tolerance that were being expressed on those walls. This was Glasgow in the 1970s. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. So they are, it seems to me, anything but a gateway to a global community of netizens, all exchanging views and recipes for quiche Lorraine. That is not what we've got. What we got is an incredible money-making machine where you search and your advertisements that you see carry you to Amazon, and the algorithms try to guess what it is that you'd like to buy, and sometimes you buy it. That's an amazing money-making machine, and I give all credit to the men and women who built those businesses. But the unintended consequences of an interconnected world include a world in which my wife and others who bravely argue for a reform of Islam are threatened, abused, have obscenities hurled at them. That is the reality of this interconnected world, as surely as the commercial exploits of Jeff Bezos and company. So we can't wish it away, but we must use it with care. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is some brave new world that's been created in Silicon Valley. We now live out there, and it's fascinating to get up close and see exactly how that works. When they tell you, as Mark Zuckerberg keeps telling us, that his only goal was to create a global community in which everybody would exchange views, put on your "I'm very skeptical" hat, okay? Because that is not the prime motivation of Silicon Valley. The prime motivation of Silicon Valley is to make money from you. Shall I take a couple more questions? I think the most senior lion has raised his hand, and as we dragged him away from his garden to be here this evening, he should certainly have the microphone. Martin's just behind you, sir, with the mic.
You said to try this. No, it don't work.
That works okay. I can hear you.
Didn't it? Well, I have a very simple question for you, really. If you had the opportunity to go back in time to visit a certain part of history, which would you choose?
That's a wonderful question. So if I had the opportunity to go back in time to any part of history, which time would I choose? Now, I know what period Thomas would choose, almost certainly the Jurassic, so that we could go and see the dinosaurs, which so fascinate him now. But I wouldn't go back that far. Apart from anything else, I don't want to get eaten by a Tyrannosaurus or a Velociraptor. They're much bigger than us. If I could go back in time, I would go back to the middle of July 1914. And I would work the phones and send as many telegrams as I could. Try to get meetings with the foreign ministers. I don't suppose I'd get access to the kings and emperors. And I would say, stop this now. This is nuts. That's what I would do. I'd be surprised if there was no war memorial to the dead of 1914, 1918 in or near this church. There's certainly such a memorial in every church in Scotland. And I'm just looking around trying to spot it. It's outside. If one thinks back through all of history and asks, what was the biggest error? What was the stupidest act? The First World War has to be it. We had to fight World War II. The enemies we faced then were implacable and lethal. But it's hard to make the argument that World War I was really necessary. And given that what it ultimately produced was World War II, not fighting World War I would have saved millions, tens of millions, maybe even more, maybe more than 100 million lives. And these were lives that were cut short when men and women were young. Most of the soldiers who fought at the Somme and at Passchendaele were the age of Thomas's older brothers, 18, 23. The amount of human suffering that was caused by those decisions in the summer of 1914 is unimaginable. So if that time machine existed, I wouldn't hesitate to change history. It'd be very awkward for me because when I came back, all my books would be obsolete. And I'd have this incredibly dull 20th century to write about it, with the books with titles like The Long Peace and The Century When Not Much Happened. But on balance, I'd pay that price to give those young men and the many young women and children who lost their lives in the world wars a chance to have what we have all enjoyed, which is peace and the chance to focus on the domestic, focus on the little things in life, and not have to worry about a steel projectile being fired at you from across no man's land, which could blow you to fragments in a split second. It's very close to the witching hour, but I don't know, we seem to be on a roll here. There are more questions. Yes, sir.
I hope you didn't meet the Mad Hatter down that road.
Oh yes, many.
George Santayana made a very famous statement once, those who ignore the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. Is that this current situation?
Yes, that is a very famous saying that Santayana wrote. Those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. And I passionately believe that. My great fear is that we are, by and large, led by men and women who haven't studied history. And that ignorance of history leads them to repeat mistakes that it seems incredible could ever be repeated. One can think of many examples of this, but I'll give you just one. As I was researching the life of Henry Kissinger, I was astonished to find his descriptions of Vietnam in the 1960s and what was going wrong with the American effort in Vietnam almost perfectly matched what had been written about the situation in Iraq after 2003. And one of the men who had served in the administration of President George W. Bush that had invaded Iraq wrote to me and said, "Reading your book astounded me because I had not realized that we had already made those mistakes once before in Vietnam." Now, there was an educated man who'd reached a position of power. If he'd only studied the Vietnam War, he might have realized the pitfalls that would be so easily fallen into in Iraq. So I want our leaders to study history. And I want them, if they didn't study it at university, to do it before they get into power. I argued in an article last year with my old friend Graham Allison that the President of the United States should have a council of historical advisors. He already has a council of economic advisors, fat lot of use they are. But a council of historical advisors might actually be of some use. Now, I must say, when I wrote this article, I was not really expecting anybody to take it remotely seriously. Well, let me tell you something amazing. The co-author of that article is my old friend Graham Allison of Harvard. And Graham has just published a book entitled Destined for War. Can China and the United States avoid Thucydides' trap? It's a book in which he uses history to explain the dangers of a war between China and the United States, whether over North Korea, over the South China Sea. It could be over any number of issues. To my delight and amazement, I read today that Graham had been invited to the White House to brief the President and his National Security Advisor and other members of the Trump administration about his book. Most people in this country, I would imagine most people in this church, have a very low opinion of Donald Trump. And I don't entirely blame you for that. I didn't exactly write positively about Mr. Trump last year. But the fact that Graham has been invited to the White House to talk about his book gives me just a little glimmer of hope. I don't think the President knows too much about Thucydides. In fact, he probably thinks it's a resort on one of the Greek islands. But the good news is that his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, and his Defense Secretary, James Mattis, are both highly educated men who, in addition to being great soldiers, are serious historians. So we can learn from history. And I think it's beginning to sink into the political elites that we have to learn from history. And now that we have a chance to have another Prime Minister, who knows how soon, we should, I hope, look for somebody who has a sense of history. By the way, that does not include Boris Johnson, before anybody thinks of that. Let me take another question. Yes, sir.
As we in Britain seek to find our way through or negotiate our way through many of the issues that confront us today, is it possible to identify with what many would describe as British values to underpin our ability to deal with a rapidly changing situation?
That's a very challenging question. What are British values? How easily could one define them? I think if we had to sit down now and write a few words down to capture British values, we'd include fair play in the list. There's always been a sense in this country of fairness. There's a myth that during World War II, a poster appeared saying, "Keep calm and carry on." You've probably all seen this. It is a myth, though, because that poster was never used. The reason it was never used is that we already were calm. And so there was no need to tell the British public to keep calm and carry on. That's what we do. So calmness and remaining calm in the face of adversity. The actual poster that was used during World War II, the one that did appear, said simply, and I'm going to misquote it because I only discovered this recently, that our liberty was in danger and worth fighting for. It's actually a much better sentiment than keep calm and carry on. When I'm asked abroad to try to sum up what British values stand for, I usually end up quoting Churchill at some point. Churchill said many profound and great things, but he was also funny. And the third thing I would include in my list of British values is that we always retain a sense of humour. And we're best at that in the face of the most severe adversity. Churchill's many witticisms include the observation that the United States will always do the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. It's true and it's funny. Democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, apart from all the others that have been tried from time to time. True and funny. We must remember that Churchillian spirit. We have very tough times ahead of us in this country. Last year I warned that Brexit would be like a divorce. It would cost much more and last much longer than those beginning it expected. I still think that's true. I think the ultimate expense will turn out to be roughly what the Treasury said it would be, and that my friend George Osborne will be in large measure vindicated on that score. The question is, will it be worth it? And it will only be worth it. It will only be worth going through this extraordinarily tedious, frustrating process if at the end of it we can make the country a better governed country. It's not enough to take back control. It's what you do with the control that matters. If British values still count for anything, we will apply them to that challenge. We'll keep calm and we'll keep our sense of humour, but we must not lose sight of the fact that this won't be fun. We believe in fair play. There are 27 countries on the other side of this particular contest. Now, I don't know about you, but 1 against 27 has never been an arrangement I've liked, and in all the fights that I've fought in my life, I've tried to avoid that ratio. That is going to make it an extremely arduous, and it will seem very unfair fight. At the end of it all, we have to do things for ourselves, at the national level as well as at the local level, that justify all this. I think it's conceivable that we could, in fact, govern ourselves better. There's a lot wrong with the way this country functions, the way its schools function. Yes, even the way the sacred National Health Service functions. We know that it isn't perfect, that the waiting lists are real. We know too the inequalities that have widened in this country. There's much that we can fix. And we can no longer blame after Brexit the shortcomings of British life on Brussels. So that's the spirit in which I think we need to approach this. We've committed ourselves to something that won't be fun and won't be easy. But it will not be worth it if at the end of it all, 10 years from now, Britain isn't a better governed country than it is now. And if it can be the best governed country in Europe, then that will have been worth doing. I don't want to put money on that, but let's at least try. Let's at least tell our politicians that is what we voted for. You voted for. Let me conclude by looking back this time last year. I came to Scare not long before the referendum. And at the point at which I got off the train, I was still relatively confident that the referendum would be won by Remain. Between the railway station and Scare, Richard put me right. He said, no, everybody here is for Brexit. And I went to the Prince of Wales to conduct my own research. Sample size of 1 is too small. And sure enough, I sat next to the man who owns the biggest off-licence in Bridgend. He may be here. And he explained to me his thinking on the issue. He said, do you know what my best-selling beers are? And I said, no, I do not know what your best-selling beers are. He said, my best-selling beers are Polish and Lithuanian beer. And I said, I therefore infer, because that's how I talk in the Prince of Wales, I therefore infer that you will be voting for Remain, as your biggest customers are EU citizens currently working here in the United Kingdom. Not bloody likely, he replied. It just goes to show how much money they're making off us. That was one of those moments that I often have in the Prince of Wales, when the light bulb goes on above my head. And I realised at that moment, if that man was going to vote for Brexit, despite the fact that his best customers were Polish and Lithuanian, we were going to lose. And I told George Osborne, we have a problem. I'm in South Wales. People think of it as being a Labour stronghold. They're all going to vote for Brexit. We have a problem, and they don't care how much it costs. So I learn a lot when I come here. I learn a lot. I learn a lot more when I come here than when I sit in London. And that is part of the answer to the question that I began by asking. Why is a Scotsman in a church in South Wales? You've all been very patient on a very hot evening. It's now very nearly 20 to 9. I can assure you the pubs will stay open a lot longer than 9 o'clock. We're not in England. Thank you all for being such a great audience. Support the Lions. Join, if you haven't, the Lions. Participate in the networks that are making Porthcawl great again. Thank you very much.